Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Kelly's webinar on Saturn transits today. This is actually kind of a part two from a series that she started up last month on Saturn. So if you missed that one, you can tune in. You'll still be able to follow along with this one, even if you missed that one. But if you are enjoying today's webinar and you didn't pick up the first one, I'll find that link and drop it in the chat window for you. But thanks so much for joining us again, Kelly. I'm excited to see your presentation today.
Thanks so much, Tony. And thanks to everyone who is joining us. Yeah, we did the Saturn transits through the houses last month. So we went through each house and talked a little bit about what Saturn in that house might mean. And today we're going to focus on the visible or the traditional planets and look at what Saturn transiting those planets might indicate or bring up in your lives based on your chart. So we still have a fair bit of material to get through. So I'm not going to talk about transiting Saturn in aspect to natal Saturn. So we're not looking at Saturn returns and things like that today. Instead, we're going to look at transiting Saturn in aspect to your natal sun, your natal moon, your natal Mercury, natal Venus, natal Mars, and natal Jupiter. And I'm going to share some theory and also a brief example. We've got examples, I think, for almost every planet. So time pending, we'll be able to go through those as well. And of course, we'll have some time for questions at the end. So with that said, let us begin. So I'll get the presentation up. There we go. Okay, so I wanted to begin with a quote by Rumi, because so much of one of the things I wanted to share through this series, or this sort of two-part training on Saturn, was to talk a little bit about the importance of transits from Saturn, how much you're going to use them in your practice, how important they are in terms of tracking in your own chart. And a great way to really get to know Saturn better is by following Saturn transits. I was talking about this with a group of students in my timing courses earlier this week about how you learn a lot about the birth chart and you get a level of understanding about your natal chart. But when you go further into timing and predictive astrology, what you learn there feeds back into helping you understand the way a birth chart works as well. So this is going to be hopefully building your relationship and your understanding of the essence of Saturn. So hopefully we'll be able to, cover off some of the main theory, but go a little bit beyond that. And one quality that I think is very Saturnian is the quality of deliberation. And this short extract of a poem by Rumi speaks a little bit to what I think we're all working with in some way, shape, or form when we are in a Saturn transit. And this quote, this little passage, I've got an extract of it on the screen, but I think I'll read you the full passage. So the full passage starts, "A friend remarks to the prophet, 'Why is it that I always make bad business deals? It's like a spell. I become distracted by business talk and get led into the wrong decisions.' Muhammad replies, 'Stipulate with every transaction that you need 3 days to make sure.' Deliberation is one of the qualities of God. Throw a dog a bit of something and he'll sniff to see if he wants it. Be that careful. Sniff with your wisdom nose. Get clear and then decide." The universe came into being gradually over 6 days. God could have just commanded, "Be." Little by little, a person reaches 40 and 50 and 60 and feels more complete. And one of the things, there's a few pieces I love about this passage. I just love the concept of having a wisdom nose and sniffing and using that for our decisions. But what this passage is sort of indicating is that some of the decisions we make that we might come to later regret come out of situations where we don't take the time to reflect or check in with ourselves. We're making decisions under pressure or because we're not concentrating or what have you. And so there's something here about whenever you can, and you're in a big Saturn transit, giving yourself some time and space. And when we get into exploring some of the myth and meaning of Saturn as we go through these transits today, it's going to become a little bit more clear just how important deliberation, like space or energy or time to to deliberate with events, when you're in a Saturn transit. So that's part of our inspiration as we begin today. Now, there are some common themes or common qualities or the tone of being in a Saturn transit that we're going to discuss. And this would apply to specific topics as indicated by the specific natal planet receiving the transit, but there is some common ground here. And we're talking about Saturn transits in the context of primarily Saturn making things like a conjunction, a square, or an opposition to the planets in your birth chart. There is a piece where, yes, there are some subtle differences between like Saturn square a natal planet or Saturn opposite a natal planet, but there are some very common themes. If Saturn is square your natal Mars or opposite your natal Mars, there's a whole breadth of descriptive and predictive material that you can use in both scenarios. So it's beyond the scope of our time here together to get into the differences of like Saturn conjunct a planet versus square a planet. But in my experience, if you can understand how to interpret Saturn transiting that planet, you'll be able to apply that to any specific aspect that's going on. Clients often report feeling a heaviness or this quality of being weighed down when they're in a Saturn transit. And that can show up in some different ways. It could be a physical heaviness of being tired or sore in the body. It can be an emotional or a psychological heaviness of feeling a pressure to manage a lot of things or to make some big decisions. But that quality of being kind of carrying a weight that is heavier is very common. Saturn's qualities as a planet are the qualities of coolness or cold and dry or dryness. And each of those qualities tells us something about the way that we are most likely to engage with life and events when we're in a Saturn transit. If the cool quality is associated with slowing down, it's associated with stillness or moving at a more measured, manageable pace, we might say. And so if you feel like you're dealing with maybe delays or limitations in a Saturn transit, it may be a clue that prior to that, you had been moving a little too quickly, and to go deep and to really do the restructuring that the Saturn transit is indicating, you may have to go slower. You may have to focus on fewer things. One of the big phrases that I say a lot for clients with Saturn transits is that this is a cycle about quality, not quantity. So when we're in a Saturn transit, we have to somehow restructure or make changes so that we are focused on fewer things, but more important things. And sometimes to figure that out, we have to pause or slow down. The dryness of Saturn creates space and a quality of separateness. And sometimes we're in situations where we have an appropriate amount of space and then we end up with more than that. And when we have an excess of separateness, we can end up with things like feeling lonely or isolated. Sometimes when we're in a Saturn transit, we're so in something or so entangled with a person or a situation that we can't think straight or see clearly anymore. And so when you're in that type of situation and a Saturn transit shows up, the pulling back or the turning within that the Saturn transit indicates can actually help you get a broader perspective or a more honest perspective. So while it can, of course, be difficult to deal with feelings of loneliness or isolation, it is sometimes from being back or away from other people or other things that we can get a sense of the fullness of the situation, the truth of the situation, or the reality of the situation. So it might not feel great in the moment, but it may create a situation where you can come to an understanding that you couldn't previously. One totally underrated thing that I believe Saturn transits do is they create clarity. They help you see things as they are, not as you'd like them to be or what their potential could be. And sometimes when we get really honest with ourselves about what is or isn't working, or about the truth of something that happened in the past, it can help us prioritize, can help us figure out what our priorities perhaps could be. One thing with Saturn transits is they often help you update so that your priorities and your commitments are relevant to your current circumstances rather than the circumstances that you might have had 2 years ago or 5 years ago or 7 years ago. One of the things I think we all find the most difficult of working through in a Saturn transit is this quality of making necessary choices. And when I say necessary choices, Saturn is a real no muss, no fuss kind of planet. And he is not interested in excess or frivolity. He's interested in the essentials. What are your core requirements to do with safety or security or protection or preservation? And sometimes we lose track of those because we are focused on the bright, shiny things. And in a Saturn transit, we're called back to make some of those important choices. Now, making a choice or making a decision is not something that many of us modern humans enjoy. We prefer to leave our options open or to figure out how to have many things rather than choose the one or two things that will be most nourishing or most meaningful for us. And so one of the things that I think can be a bit of a source of angst or stress in a Saturn transit is that you find yourself in a situation where you simply cannot continue to keep all your options open, time-wise or energy-wise or financially, and you have to make a choice. Part of this choice making is an invitation to embrace the reality of the situation that you're in. And the embracing the reality goes back to some of these features about being honest, being clear, seeing it as it is. And as we do that, that weaves us into a really practical expression of Saturn transits, which has to do with time management skills. So as we get more honest about how much we can do in a day, whether that's with family or our jobs or our health and fitness, we start to realize that we start to get a clearer sense of what we can do in an hour, what we can do in a day, what we can do in a week. And sometimes it's less than what we thought. But that honesty and that clarity can help us make those choices about which things should go into the schedule or the plan and which things that should more realistically be left out. And this all feeds into one of the biggest internal growth pieces that I think we get out of Saturn transits, that it teaches us about our sense of ourself. And it is an opportunity to develop a clearer set of rules or boundaries in terms of how we interact with the world at large. And Saturn is the planet that wants to consolidate our energy and effort behind the people or projects that are most important to us. And to do that, we have to get better at saying no to the many extra invitations or offers that, or the demands on our time and energy that we deal with every day and every week. And if you take nothing else from today, one way to transform your experience of a Saturn transit is to start saying no a lot more often. No, I won't be able to help you out with that. I'd love to, but I'm unavailable. I'm so sorry that that's gone on and that you're having to manage that. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to contribute. It's really difficult to do, but it is part of developing and firming up this sort of energetic backbone or this internal sense of firmness about what is important to you and how, if you're saying yes to the things that are important to you, it will not be possible to say yes to other things as well. So one thing we do in a Saturn transit is we shift our sense of what's important away from external demands or constructs and towards internal things. And so when you're dealing with choices or changes or practical matters in a Saturn transit, I want you to think about, is this because this other person or situation wants something from me? Or is this because I have decided this is important for me? So that's some things to think about with Saturn themes as we're getting started. Now, I also wanted to make a mention, I know students often get a little worried about having a Saturn transit. And that's reasonable. It's going to be an effortful time where we're not going to escape without having to put some work in to one thing or another. But I wanted to make sure you were all aware that we have Saturn transits on a fairly often or frequent schedule. Saturn will make one of these dynamic or more dramatic aspects by transit to each planet in your chart every 7 years. For instance, if Saturn is conjunct or square your sun now, 7 years in the future, Saturn might be square or opposite your sun. And then 7 years on from that, Saturn will come back and make another one of those aspects, either the conjunction, the square, or the opposition. So that every 7 years, you're having to do some of this Saturnian work about the sun and the sun stuff in your birth chart. The same thing is going on with, say, Venus in your chart, where every 7 years, Saturn is either conjunct or square or opposite Venus in your own personal chart. And as Saturn does that, you've got the Saturn transit to your natal Venus journey and the Saturn transit to your natal Sun journey, but they're not happening necessarily on the same 7-year cycle. So the key with working with any timing cycles, but particularly Saturn, which is our focus today, is to identify which part of my birth chart is being drawn into the Saturnian grip at this point in time. And it won't affect every topic in your life, but if you get a deep understanding of your natal planet that is receiving the Saturn transit, it can let you know where to put your effort and your time and your concentrated thinking and planning for the timeline of the Saturn transit. Now, some Saturn transits are what we call a one-hit wonder, where they might be 3 or 4 weeks where the transiting Saturn is exactly in aspect to your natal planet. But most transiting Saturn aspects last about 8 to 9 months, where transiting Saturn will make a direct aspect to your natal planet, a retrograde aspect to your natal planet, and then a direct aspect to your natal planet by exact degree. And those 3 activations will be about 4 weeks of time each and happening 3 in an 8 or a 9 month period. So when you're having a Saturn transit to a planet in your birth chart, it's not necessarily something that's going to take up even a whole year of your life, but it is going to demand your full attention and energy and best effort for that 8 to 9 month period. Now, just before we get into Saturn transiting the planets themselves, I want to take a moment to make sure we really get a good sense of the natal planet that is being affected or changed by Saturn. When we're talking about Saturn transits, we're talking about transits that are marking these essential points on our journey to maturity. Saturn transits are times in our lives where we can gain wisdom, hard-won wisdom that we get through lived experience, through grappling with stuff that might confront or scare us a little bit, through exploring our vulnerability and the kind of edge between being vulnerable and being firm. Developing patience is a huge thing that Saturn tries to teach us. And one thing that we all learn to do in varying ways through a Saturn transit is to start to understand how close the faraway future really is, so that we make choices in the present that don't just make us feel better today, but will provide us some type of reward or gift in the future. So there's a change in sort of time frame and priority and perspective when we're in a Saturn transit. We stop thinking about, is this good for today or tomorrow? And we start thinking about, how is this helping me build something for the future? Or if it's not helping you build something for the future, that's going to be your clue about what needs attending to and restructuring. A Saturn transit is about taking that slow time to digest and to deliberate. So you don't have to rush with your choices. You've got this 8 to 9 month time frame, but you do need to think about, what are you going to adjust as you go through. Okay, so we're just going to come straight through to this natal planet section, where I wanted to give you some things to think about. And when we get into our examples, we'll be addressing some of these. So these are points to consider about the natal planet that is receiving the Saturn transit and has to figure out how to respond to Saturn. So this is all natal chart, interpretive stuff. And we don't have time to teach you all of these today. So this is a little bit of assumed knowledge. Or if there are some terms or familiars here that terms or phrases that you're not familiar with here, that could be something to add into your astrology toolbox as we move forward. I will show you these things in action in the examples. And many of you, if you're not familiar with it, will be able to put things together from there. But I wanted to honor our intention to talk about the timing component of Saturn today. So this is what I'm keeping in mind as I interpret a Saturn transit in the context of a birth chart. And so things you want to think about, first of all, identify which planet in your chart is being transited by Saturn. So is transiting Saturn aspecting your moon or your Mercury or your sun, for instance? What are the general topics of that planet? For instance, the moon might be about emotions and family, or Mercury might be about communication. What are the chart specific topics that that planet is responsible for? And that's a technique we use a lot in ancient forms of astrology that has to do with house rulership. And we're going to see this in action in a number of our examples today. What this basically means is that if transiting Saturn is in aspect to the moon in your chart, in addition to the regular moon topics that you'll want to include in your prediction for that transit, you will also want to acknowledge how this transit will affect the topics of the Cancer house in the chart. So if transiting Saturn is in aspect to the natal moon, that is going to affect the houses that the moon is responsible for, which is the house where the moon sign of Cancer is. You can also think about how important is the planet receiving the Saturn transit in the context of your birth chart. The ascendant ruling planet is a really important planet in ancient astrology chart interpretation, and it becomes important in timing. And another planet known as the sect light, which is basically the sun in a day chart and the moon in a night chart, is also very important. And I'm going to show you a couple of things here with these examples we've got coming up. What condition is the natal planet in your chart in? And that describes whether you're more likely to deal with a difficult experience through the Saturn transit, or whether you're more likely to get a great outcome from the Saturn transit. And we have a couple of charts that will help illustrate that as well. So all of these points about the natal planet in your chart receiving the transit is going to influence the kinds of things that happen, whether you get a more productive, constructive experience or outcome of the Saturn transit, or whether you get some of the more classically difficult or uncomfortable Saturn transit experience. So these are the things that I'll hold in my mind. And we're going to pop in to one example quite quickly right now, just to have a little look at some of these theories in action so you can see what I'm talking about. Okie dokie. So this is a client's chart, and we've worked together for a long time. And over that time, they've had a variety of different Saturn transits. And I want to tell you a little bit of a tale about the difference between two of the Saturn transits that they've experienced. And this will help illustrate some of the theories about the topics connected to each planet and how the condition of the natal planet factors in to the experiences. So going back to 2015, when transiting Saturn was in the sign of Sag, this individual had transiting Saturn go over Mercury in their chart. So they have natal Mercury in Sag at 2 degrees. And there was a period of time in 2015 where Saturn was kind of bouncing over 2 degrees Sag. And for this individual, this was a very, very stressful time. They were dealing with an incredibly difficult individual in their workspace, and it caused a lot of mental health stress for them. There was also an issue going on with a friend of theirs who was dealing with their own demons, and that was creating a real heaviness for this individual. At the same time, this individual was also struggling with a difficult financial situation where they were struggling to kind of manage their finances and get on top of some of their loan repayments and things like that. So how do we get all of those topics out of this Saturn conjunct Mercury transit? Well, we know it's going to affect something to do with money, income, and possibly work because it's happening inside the second house. We know it's going to affect the mind and the mental state and communication because it's a Saturn transit to Mercury. The topic of friendship comes in because in this chart, one of Mercury's signs, Virgo, is on the 11th house cusp. And so the Saturn Mercury transit is bringing up stuff going on with the 11th house. And the other Mercury ruled sign, Gemini, is on the 8th house cusp, which is the part of the chart that deals with debts and loans and financial matters along those lines. What made this such a difficult time for this individual? The condition of natal Mercury. Mercury in Sagittarius is technically in a condition known as detriment. And so Saturn conjunct or square or opposite a planet that is in detriment in the chart is one of those indicators that is more likely to lead to a more stressful or difficult period. What was really interesting is that the pressures or the difficulties kind of went hand in hand with the Saturn Mercury transit. You might also, if you're quite sharp-eyed, realize that as Saturn continued moving through Sag, it would also make a square back to Mars in Virgo in this chart. And so some of the pressures and stresses to do with friends or to do with even the mind, because Mars is in Virgo, they did continue a little bit on the timeline of the Saturn-Mars transit. And so from the lived experience of the client, the time frame of Saturn conjunct Mercury and Saturn square Mars was these periods of more kind of distress or discomfort where life was just harder for them to manage, particularly in some of these specific ways for those times. I wanted to use a chart like this. I know it's speaking to when Saturn was in Sag, but we're talking about Saturn transiting the planets, and these theories and ideas will apply regardless of the signs. And I know at the moment, as we're recording this, transit Saturn is in Aquarius. And so some of you will have planets in Aquarius and maybe also in Taurus. And so you're looking at the different timelines of Saturn in Aquarius to your natal planet there, and then Saturn from Aquarius squaring your planet in, say, Taurus. So just to be keeping in mind that one transit can kind of run into another occasionally based on our natal chart. Okay, so hopefully that gives you an idea of that, and also why it was so difficult, because it's Saturn to a planet in detriment. Now, more recently, as many of you know, we've had Saturn in Capricorn. And while Saturn was in Capricorn, this individual experienced Saturn opposing the moon in their chart. Now, this was a very different experience for them. This was a time of some professional success where they were at a very kind of exclusive privileged role within their industry. There was an international kind of expat connection to their experiences during this time. They developed a new commitment to self-care and their physical health and fitness. They did experience a little bit of separation from their loved ones and their family. But for the most part, this individual feels like they were really able to achieve something that they were quite proud of during this particular transit. And this is a little more recent. Of course, we know Saturn was going through this particular part of the sky in 2020. I think the first part of 2020 primarily, but this was sort of a theme for them throughout the year, calendar year 2020, which was difficult for many of us for many reasons. But in the context of this individual's lived experience, they were able to really kind of achieve something that they could be proud of. So what made this, how did we get those topics here? Well, we know we're going to get topics to do with some sort of international or global experience because this is a planet in the 9th house. It's also the planet that rules the 9th house. The moon is a planet in the chart that definitely speaks to our physical health and vitality. So when you have Saturn conjunct, square, or opposite the moon, stuff will come up about your physical body, about what's not working, about what's connected to you aging, and about the things that you might need to be more organized about from a maintenance or a prevention perspective. One of the reasons that really speaks to this sense of like achievement or outcome, like productive outcome for this person, is that the moon in their chart is in rulership. The moon is at home in its home sign of Cancer. And so with transiting Saturn in aspect to a planet that is in rulership or exalted, maybe even a planet that has triplicity strength, for those of you that work with that, you're more likely to get experiences that might still require effort and dedication and hard work. It's still a Saturn transit, but you may be more, it might be for an experience that you've chosen, that you're proud to be involved in, or that you're more willingly engaging with. And that's the difference of the condition of the natal planet that Saturn is activating. Now, it's still an opposition, and this person was still, like many of us, I guess, in 2020, not able to see some of their dearest family members as much as they actually weren't able to see them for the whole year. And so we still see some of that kind of barrier of Saturn to the moon coming in, of not having the emotional support and connection that you might like. Now, that was partly because this individual's choice to do this thing, but they still had to deal with a quality of that sense of being a little disconnected or isolated from loved ones. And that's a very common Saturn moon transit experience. We're going to say a little bit more about Saturn in aspect by transit to all the visible planets shortly, but I wanted to just set us up with this example as we got going, so you could have a sense of some of the things of what I'm talking about. In this piece, I was also able to really illustrate for you the importance of the house rulers and how they lead to topics that we work with in a transit. It's one of the reasons why using this house rulership model is so helpful to enable you to be more specific about which parts of the chart, and therefore which parts of the life, are really being pressured and kind of changed through the timeline of the Saturn transit. So if Saturn is transiting Mars in your natal chart, make sure you include the topics of the Aries and Scorpio houses in your interpretation. If Saturn is transiting Mercury, just like in the example we looked at, do include the topics of the houses where you have Gemini and Virgo. If Saturn is transiting the moon, just like in the chart we looked at, make sure you include the topics of the Cancer house. If Saturn is transiting Venus in your chart, make sure you include the topics of your Taurus and Libra houses. For the Sun, we look to the Leo house. And for Jupiter, we're going to include the topics of the Sagittarius and Pisces houses as well. So I'm hoping that piece is getting a little more self-explanatory as we work through our material together, and it will really transform your transit forecasting skills. Some of the, let's have a quick look here. Look at me timing back. I don't know that I'll read through all of these points here. We're going to pull all of these out as we look at Saturn transiting each planet. But here are some phrases and concepts that you can incorporate into your Saturn transit predictive information. Saturn is really going to help you explore the rewards and consequences of past choices or past inaction, if you like. And in many ways, when we're in a Saturn transit, it's like the chickens come home to roost, so to speak. And that thing that you worked hard for 5 or 7 years ago, you're now reaping the rewards of. But that thing that you knew was a bit of an issue 5 or 7 years ago that you didn't quite get to doing what you thought you would like to about it, that's now back and needs your full attention. So the other piece with Saturn transits is they can really bring up this idea of endings and beginnings, that time is up or that the time is now. And one of the best ways to care for yourself through a Saturn transit, as we mentioned, is to take your time, to slow down, and to create a lot more space. So with those things said, let's turn our attention to Saturn transiting the planets individually. Okay. All right. So Saturn to the Sun. Now, one of the reasons this image really struck me for this part of our presentation is that there's something about a Saturn transit to the Sun that really speaks to the core of what's inside you. So the idea here is what is inside you that has become unexpressed, or that has been neglected or ignored, or that has been papered over by other concerns or pressures. So when Saturn is conjunct or square or opposite the Sun, you are being asked to reconnect with the stuff that is inside you. And this can be a fear, that you are, you know, that is affecting you or that has been in your life for a long time. So when you're working with like a Saturn Sun transit, and this piece could come up in other Saturn transits too, sometimes there's a specific fear or worry or concern that has to emerge. Sometimes it's an identity that you want to bring forward. And I think that word identity is really important for Sun Saturn transits. The idea that it's time to redefine who you are. And we do that in many ways by establishing what we want to be known for or associated with, and what we don't want to be known for or what we want to distance ourselves from. And so part of Saturn transits to the sun, the redefining your identity process is very much about clarifying the kinds of qualities and characteristics that you would like to develop within yourself, and the kinds of qualities or characteristics that, or habits maybe, that you know you have that you would like to change or update. The part of the Saturn Sun transit is that the sun represents this kind of central organizing force in our charts and in our lives, and it does, we get that principle because that's what the sun does in the solar system. So when Saturn transits the sun, there are things that, questions and matters and issues come up that help you reflect on and make necessary changes around what are you centering in your life? What is it that you are organizing your time and your energy around? And sometimes we think we know what that is, but we always get very clear on what it really is in a Saturn transit. And that clarity of seeing exactly what it is you are organizing things around, whether it's a person, a family, a job, a goal, that can help you decide whether that is as it should be or whether you would like to change that. One of the the qualities that the sun represents is this steadiness and this consistency. And so developing a quality of regularity is really important with the Saturn transit to the sun. Sometimes early in a Saturn transit, like particularly first or second hit, there are these pieces around, well, what's stopping me doing that? I'd like to be more consistent or regular with this thing, this goal or this person, but I find that I'm constantly not able to do that. Why is that? And there might be a boundary factor. There might be not being clear about limits factor or what have you. The sun is one of the forces of vitality in the chart, and Saturn transiting the sun can sometimes make us feel a bit older, can make us feel like we are aging, but it can also temporarily dim our vital forces so that a health condition might flare up, or a health issue we've never had before might become something we have to deal with. So if we think about Saturn as limits and the sun as vital forces, we might be learning about what inhibits the vital forces within ourselves and how we need to better manage that so we're not as diminished by different things. The sun, of course, is about light and about visibility, and Saturn is about darkness or about not being seen. And there are times when, we're dealing with a Saturn Sun transit where we're trying to redefine who gets to see us and what is it that we want to show them. And are we trying to be seen in a situation where we are not being attended to? And so sometimes we need to really kind of push or fight so that we can be acknowledged for, the important presence that we are. Sometimes we see that we are being diminished by a person or a situation, and that feeds into our choice about whether we want to stay engaged in that situation or not. Some of the questions to think about when you're having a Saturn transit to the sun are, what is it that you want to express? How would you like to go about that? And what is it that's stopping you doing that, if you like? What is it that is preventing you expressing or even leading? We know that the sun is one of the planets about leading and growing. So how is it that that what you're becoming aware of in your Saturn transit is cluing you in to something that is blocking your light? Now, the other side of this is that there are times in Sun Saturn transits where we're actually called to step up and take on much greater responsibility. We're called to be a leader, and we may have to think about what are the goals that we might have if we are to be this central organizing leader person. How would we like to guide or inspire others? And so there's a very profound internal kind of processing that goes on, like a digesting with Saturn in aspect to the sun. It's also important to think about the topics of the Leo house in your birth chart and the topics that the house is in the natal chart. So there's two primary two sets of house topics that we want to make sure we factor in here. Wherever you have Leo in your chart and the topics that the house, the sun falls in. So these are some of the keywords and concepts that will help you navigate through a Saturn transit to the sun. These types of transits will be especially important for people who are born in the daytime. So if the sun is your sect light, and in those instances, transits from Saturn to the sun can impact on career and professional direction as well. If you have a Leo ascendant where the sun is the ascendant guiding planet or ruling planet, then these Saturn transits to the sun become really important. So on the positive side, a transit from Saturn to the sun can activate leadership potential, can clarify a sense of identity and sometimes integrity, which can help you more firmly focus on what's important to you. In some of the more stressful expressions of transiting Saturn to the sun, this can create like a flatness or even a melancholy where we might not have the vital forces that we normally do. We might be flat or darker, and when I say dark, I'm using that word from a symbolic perspective to do with Saturn. If you're not bright, you're dark. And so you're inwards or you're slower or you're withdrawn. You're engaging with the archetype of the hermit, if you like. And so these are things to find a way to honor when you're in a Saturn transit with the sun so that you are not judging it as a negative. I don't think that Saturn transits are meant to be difficult or cause problems. I think that they really are intended to help you get to know yourself and help you get to better advocate for the things that really create security for you. And in the context of the sun, to help you advocate for the things that will allow you to shine to your best potential. Okay, so that's Saturn transits to the sun. Let's have a look at Saturn transits to the moon. And we have a couple of examples that we can bring in if we have time here. All right. So let's talk about this. Many of you will be thinking about Saturn transits to the moon in regards to emotions and emotional state. That is very, very true. But don't forget the physical body. So the moon is one of the main planets we use in health and medical astrology to talk about what's going on with our physical vessels. So the moon, Saturn transits to the moon can bring up both physical things as well as emotional things. I also just saw a comment there about somebody who's just experienced Saturn transits as being plain destructive and mean. And sometimes that happens. It's not as though you failed your Saturn transit if you didn't have a great outcome. Sometimes they are a little bit tests of endurance. It's a little tricky to kind of cover off everybody's unique experience because the condition of the natal planet receiving the Saturn transit is really going to speak to a lot of your personal experiences. Somebody's saying they had a big surgery when Saturn was conjunct their moon, which definitely makes sense. And that would have some physical implication and some emotional implication as well. So keeping in mind that the body is going to be part of the Saturn transit to the moon, we could be dealing with limits or challenges or reductions to our physical health and vitality. Some of those will be age related and some of those will just be simply a little challenging. There can be a quality of rededicating yourself to caring for your body, as we saw in our earlier example. And what that can look like for you, or what that looks like for each of us, might be different. For some of us, caring for our body means eating a certain type of dietary protocol. For some of us, it means making sure we get a certain amount of movement. For some of us, the sleep factor is really important. Now, all of those things are also going to contribute to your emotional well-being. So they do go hand in hand here. With Saturn transits to the moon, it's very common for stuff to come up around your home and your living situation. And there's a big piece to process through here with Saturn to the moon around how suitable is your home and living situation for your current and sort of future projected circumstances. Like, do you have a big family home and have all the kids moved out and it's time to downsize? Or are you starting a family and you're going to need more space than what you have? Maybe you're at a position in your life where you're ready to take on the responsibility of a mortgage or home ownership, or you just want to move to a larger flat that you're renting and you're going to commit more of your money or your income to your living or housing allowance. So whether we go up or down depends on your personal chart, but it's very common to do some restructuring around our home and our living situation. If we're not moving under a Saturn moon transit, there can be some sort of repairs or maintenance that are required to our home situation. Family dynamics are very common to come up under Saturn moon, especially things to do with mother or mothering. That could be you as mother if you have children. It could be you as a caring parent if you have children. It could be to do with your mother or to do with one of your parents. So it's, with the moon, we often go to the feminine with the parent, but it is not always as simple as that. We can find ourselves in a mothering type role for an aging parent, whichever parent that might be. There can be what I call this transfer of responsibility within family dynamics, where either and keep in mind that when family comes up with Saturn moon, it can either be the family that you've created, like your children and your lineage, or it can be the family you came from, your parents, elderly aunts or grandparents or what have you. And sometimes the transfer of responsibility is really obvious. Like, my child's now 10 and they're going to do a load of laundry once a week or cook a simple dinner once a week, whatever's age appropriate. Maybe it is that your parent used to be able to manage their own finances, but now they can't. And that's a burden that you're wanting to pick up for a period of time. So we're thinking about how we are dedicated to working on behalf of our family, and we're reassessing, is this reasonable? Is this maybe hard, but it's something that I'm choosing to do or feel like I have to do? It won't be easy. In my very humble opinion, in my work with clients, Saturn transiting the moon is one of the most difficult types of transits that we do have. And so I'm referring here to Saturn conjunct, square, or opposite the moon. It does tend to bring a very melancholy quality to our emotional being. We are dealing with so much about vulnerability and safety, some of these core survival instinctive needs, matters to do with the